Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third in the series now, the last of the paper one ones ready for Monday's exam. So we're looking at developmental psychology, or in particular attachment, as probably most of you know it better as. And with just 4 days to go, hopefully this will, with the other webinars, be really, really useful for you. There's some really tricky things to watch out for in attachment, so this is a particularly good session just to make sure you don't fall for one of the sort of AQA traps that might be in the exam, okay? We'll start, as we always have, just in case there's any new people here. As you know, this year is weighted much more heavily towards application and evaluation questions, with really 66% of your marks coming from those two areas. So really important you know how to answer those questions, and the purpose of this entire webinar is really focusing on those two key areas. Really interesting, if you look through the 6 sample assessment material questions that are out there for the AS and A level, there's some really, really clear patterns that emerge. Research methods appears really heavily in attachment, and the questions always seem to be centered on observations, which isn't surprising given the strange situation is part of the specification. So there seems to be a lot of observation questions coming up in this section. And really interestingly, this is the only topic where every single one of the sample assessment materials has an essay. So there's a really high probability that you might get an essay in this particular section of the paper. Like social and like memory that we've looked at already, the main type of essay that you will get in attachment will be outline and evaluate a theory rather than research, and we're going to look at 2 different theories today to outline and try and evaluate together. That seems to be the sort of predominant question that comes up. There is also some application essay questions, but those are much rarer and actually not too difficult in this particular section, actually, unlike the one we explored last night. So that's the structure of this part of the exam. Here we go. The 4 aims really for today. We're going to look at 2 different types of essays, both by Bowlby. So we've got Bowlby's Mumtropic theory of attachment and Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis, and it's really clear that you know the difference between those 2, because writing the wrong one of those would actually cost you an entire essay, unfortunately. So we're going to explore those 2. We're going to look at some application questions and make sure we know exactly how to get full marks on those, as well as some research methods questions on observational techniques, and then I'm going to do my sort of usual, try and see if we can predict what may or may come up in the exam, looking at what's come up in the sample assessment material. Okay, to start with, let's look at 2 different questions, and let's imagine you had either one of these 2, discuss Bowlby's monotropic theory of attachment or discuss Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory. These are exceptionally different questions, and it's important you know the difference between the 2. As a brief outline, the first question, the monotropic theory, is looking at how and why children form attachments with their parents. So actually, what is it that makes them form an attachment, and why is it useful for them? So that's kind of the positive, happier question. The other question, the maternal deprivation hypothesis question, is asking you to outline and evaluate what happens when children lose their attachment with their parents, and what effect does that have on their development. So I put them in green and red because one's really the positive, why are we forming attachments and why is it a good thing? The other question is looking at what happens when we lose attachments and what are the negative impacts of that, okay? So let's start with the first question, discuss Bowlby's monotropic theory. I think this is the easier of the 2. The nice thing about this particular essay is that, like all essay questions, it's 6 marks for knowledge, and you need to include around 4 to 6 key points. And students at where I work have, for years, come up with this mnemonic to help them remember 5 of the key points. So if you can just remember this little phrase, a Snapchat makes images, it will help you to remember the 5 key sort of ingredients you want to include in your outline to Bowlby's monotropic theory. Okay, the A stands for adaptive, S social releases, C critical period, M monotropy, and I internal working model. Okay, just to show you what that looks like on the back of one of our flashcards, each one of those points really is just a sentence to explain what we mean. Okay, and I'm going to talk you through how that will appear as an AO1 knowledge part of your essay. So let's imagine we were writing that, and I'm trying to keep my outline as per usual to 100 words, and yet again I've tried to do it exactly 100 words. The starting point for this would be, according to Bowlby, attachments are adaptive, which means they give our species, humans, some type of advantage which helps us to survive. Okay, I'll come on to innate Adam in a moment. Babies exhibit these features called social releases, which are things that make parents really want to care for them. Okay, and I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. So social releases are something that makes mums want to care for their children, and that's how children attach to them. Okay, according to Bowlby, babies have to form an attachment during a critical period, and that's between birth and 2.5 years old. Some books disagree, but you're safe going with 2.5 years old. And during that time, they form a special attachment with their mother or a mother substitute, which is known as a monotropic attachment. Okay, they form one special relationship. Last but not least, Bowlby said that through this monotropic attachment, this acts as a model for our future relationships, which is known as an internal working model, which is then part of what we know as the continuity hypothesis. Okay. Now that's exactly 100 words, count me if you don't believe me, and you might think, okay, we've explained everything. It might be nice if you're a quick writer in particular to sort of expand on some of those ideas. So you could elaborate some. You could say, well, social releases are broken into 2 different types. We get behavioural ones, which are things like crying, physical ones, which is like having a cute round face and big eyes, and that's what makes children, in their mum's eyes, makes their mothers want to care for them. Okay, so that would nicely elaborate that idea. We can then elaborate the bottom idea and say the idea of the internal working model is if you have a strong attachment with your mum, you're likely to have strong, healthy adult relationships. So if you've got the time, Ross, it's going to be an essay, so 12 marks. If you've got the time, this would be your outline for your AO1 section and would be enough to pick you up 4 marks, assuming that your evaluation is equally strong. Now we need to get onto the evaluation part. So that's a nice, easy way to remember the outline. As I mentioned before, you're aiming for really 3 evaluative points, 2 to 3, which provide evidence that either supports Bowlby's theory or refutes it, goes against it. Okay. I stress the importance from an examiner's point of view that it's really the quality of your evaluation, not the quantity. So although I say ideally we're looking for 3 key points, if you are short of time, 2 points that are well developed and elaborated is better than actually 3 rushed points. Okay. Now, fortunately, through the attachment topic, you will have come up with loads of different studies like Lorenz's Geese, Hazen and Schaefer's Love Quiz, and Rutter's institutionalization, which can actually all be used in this essay. So you don't really need to learn any new evaluation because a lot of the research you'll cover in this topic comes up here. I'm going to give you 2 examples, and then on the handout that will accompany this session tomorrow, be released tomorrow morning, you can try the 3rd one for yourself. These are the 3 studies on the flashcards, just to give you key ideas of what's in the method and results for each one. Okay, so as I mentioned before, I recommend when you get to evaluation, you use what's called the P technique or Burger technique. Okay, always start with your points. So I'm going to take the first one of those. I'm going to say that one strength of Bowlby's monotropic theory comes from research by Lorenz. I'm just stating my point. Okay. I'm then going to bring in my evidence. I'm going to say what Lorenz found. So Lorenz, which is the baby geese study, found that geese imprint onto the first moving object they see within a critical period. Okay, which is different books again say different times, but roughly 12 to 17 hours. And this highlights that animals form attachments really, really quickly. It also suggests that attachments are innate, something we're born with, because they do it literally instantly, as the geese are sort of biologically determined to form these attachments, okay? Emily, no, you don't need the names. If you describe it well enough, the examiners will know who you mean, so don't worry if you forget the names. You then need to bring this back in and sort of explain, well, how does that support Bowlby's monotropic theory? And this is the really important bit, okay? Always start with this matters because. So as I've done here, I would say this matters because it supports Bowlby's monotropic theory, in particular the idea of the critical period, suggesting that animals form attachments within a short period of time to help them survive. Because the idea of geese following their sort of mum around is to keep them safe from predators. It stops them being eaten by foxes and so forth. Okay. So there's the first one, following a really simple sort of PE technique. I'm going to do one more for you. Okay, I might say that further support for Bowlby's monotropic theory comes from research by Hazen and Schaefer. Okay, again, I'm going to bring in what they found. So they investigated the idea of the internal working model in Bowlby's theory through a questionnaire called the Love Quiz. What they found was that there was a positive correlation between the type of attachment you have as a child, okay, and then your later sort of love experiences. So children who had a nice, loving, securely attached childhood went on to develop strong and healthy adult relationships. And again, I need to say why that matters. Well, this matters because it clearly supports the idea of an internal working model, suggesting that our early experiences actually do dictate our later adult relationships. Okay, there's your second one. So 2 nicely written sort of P paragraphs. If you had time to move on to a third, I would go on to research by Rutter. And I'm going to provide you on the handout with the information to go in the evidence, and I'm going to get you to explain it back. So I'm not going to do all 3 for you tonight. That's something for you to practice tomorrow to make sure you get these techniques, okay? So that's the first type of essay. If, however, you got the other essay, which is discuss Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory, this is a very, very different type of essay, okay? Again, let's imagine that we're outlining this essay to begin with. And And what I've said already is that this is on his maternal deprivation theory, okay? Sophie, when it comes to evaluation, you could do all strengths, you could do all limitations, it doesn't actually matter. Which is not the same as his theory of attachment, okay? And this is really, really important, okay? So yeah, do not mention the entire way in which children attach. It's really, really important you don't do that for this particular essay, okay? However, to make matters even more confusing, one of the ideas that we are going to talk about in this essay is actually part of Bowlbys' theory, okay? So we're focusing on the idea of the critical period here. And what we're talking about is deprivation. What happens when the child's attachment is broken during that critical period? So we're looking at what effects does that have. So we would want to define what deprivation actually is. So it occurs when an attachment bond is broken. Okay, and what Bowlby was interested in is what does that do to the child if that happens in the first 2.5 years? Now, rather fortunately for this essay, we can actually just quote Bowlby himself, because then we definitely can't be wrong, because he has a lovely sort of phrase and saying that goes with this, okay, which will actually form part of the essay. So he said, if an infant is unable to develop a warm, continuous relationship with their mother or a mother substitute, so that could be a foster carer, for example, before 2.5 years old, which is the critical period, then the child will have difficulty forming relationships with other people and be at risk of behavioural and emotional disorders. Okay, so he's made it quite clear what he thinks is going to happen. What that means is we can stick that straight into our essay. We can, if we can remember it, literally quote him word for word. So you'll see what I've done first of all. This is the first part of my A1. I'm saying what deprivation is. It occurs when the attachment bond is formed but then broken. I'm then quoting Bowlby directly. According to Bowlby, if an infant is unable to develop this warm, loving relationship with his mother or mother substitute during the critical period, then they're at risk of forming difficulty forming relationships and behaviour emotional problems. Now, clearly that's not enough, and that's what makes this essay challenging. So what we then need to do is pick up on the areas that Bowlby is saying the child might be damaged in. So he's saying that they might have difficulty forming relationships, they might struggle behaviourally, and they might have emotional disorders as well. What we then want to do is say, well, what might that look like, okay? So if we think about behavioural disorders, they might be sort of delinquent at school or difficult children at school, so we would mention that. We then might say what emotional problems they might get, and Bowlby said actually maybe some of these children might go on to develop depression or something he termed affectionist psychopathy, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. You could then say how it's going to affect their ability to form relationships. So by not having that internal working model, they're going to struggle to form relationships later on in life. So what you're doing here is bringing in an example for each of these. So that on the screen now would be your AO1 for this particular essay, okay? I can see someone's already mentioned what we're going to go on to use for our evaluation, the juvenile thieves study, which is great. So this is your AO1. We're focusing on the negative effects to children if that attachment bond is broken. As I mentioned before, we're aiming for, again, 3 evaluation points, and actually this time we're going to look to include Bowlby's research on juvenile thieves. Okay, there's a case study, a brilliant case study by Robertson and Robertson on someone called Little John. Okay, and last but not least, we can look at actually how Bowlby's research has actually contributed to the development of sort of childcare practices in the UK. Okay, so again, we'll think about that again. You might say that one strength of Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory comes from his research on juvenile thieves, which someone's already mentioned. Okay. You'll go on to bring in your evidence. What did he found? Well, he looked at a group of 16 thieves who were diagnosed as affectionist psychopaths, and what he meant by that is that these were people that really didn't care that they'd actually committed a crime. They had no sense of sort of guilt for doing it. And what he found was that 86% of those affectionist psychopaths had a prolonged separation from their mother during childhood, compared to just 4% of a control group. Okay. We then need to say, well, why does that matter? Okay. Well, this matters because it clearly supports the maternal deprivation theory. In particular, that idea that actually this separation can lead to some type of emotional problem, okay? In this case, what we can call affectionist psychopathy, and also some form of antisocial behaviour. They were thieves after all, okay? So that would be a first point. We're bringing in Bowlby's own research to support his theory. The second point, we could talk about a case study of a boy called Little John. That isn't the same as Little Albert, as someone's asked. This was a case study, and I'm going to, again, on the handout, provide you with the information for Little John. So he was a boy that was separated from his mum in a hospital, and actually he went through sort of detachment. He detached from his mum and had some behavioural problems. I'll let you have a read about him and try and write your own for this one, because this is an easier point to make. So I'm going to give you all the information you need for this one. And then last but not least, a third evaluation point here would be the practical application. So I'm going to talk you through this one because it's a slightly trickier point to make. So I might say a final strength of Bowlby's deprivation theory is the application to his sort of child rearing practices, how we bring up children. We don't always need to include research because we're not going to here. So in the evidence, what we might say is Bowlby's work has led to significant changes in the way that children are cared for in hospital. So if children now sort of end up in hospital for a long period of time, their parents are now allowed to sort of visit them whenever they need to, okay? So they've opened up sort of visiting hours for parents and children in particular, so there's no restrictions, okay? Why do they do this? Well, this matters because it's had a real positive impact on actually stopping deprivation from occurring. By allowing parents to see their children whenever, what that means is that actually deprivation won't occur, and it's a really positive thing for children and their parents, okay? Just seeing some of the sort of points in the chat window now, you could I'm just trying to think. You could mention Harlow's monkeys because the monkeys actually struggle to form relationships and go on and be parents themselves later on, so that would be a perfectly good point to bring in here as well. I've just focused on 3 different ones, that's all. Okay, so just to recap, if you get either of these 2 essays, and this is really important, if it's the monotropic theory, you're outlining the 5 key components of Bowlbys theory, so adaptive, social releases, critical period, monotropic, and internal working model. And then you're going to bring in 3 evaluation paragraphs, which is really nicely done with research here. Lorenz's geese, Hazen and Schaefer's love quiz, and then Rutter's institutionalization. Okay. If your question is the maternal deprivation theory, what you need to talk about here is focus on that idea of a critical period. Okay. Talk about or quote Bowlby himself and say, well, actually, that can lead to types of sort of emotional behavioural problems, and expand on both of those. And then this time, your evaluation points would include Bowlby's 44 juvenile thieves, which is the first study we looked at, a case study by Robertson and Robertson, and then application, how that's helped improve the sort of childcare practices in hospital for children. So that's those 2 questions. Just, I can't stress enough, make sure you don't confuse the monotropic theory and the maternal deprivation hypothesis, because if you were to write the wrong answer, you would get 0 because it's the wrong theory. So really, really important. I'm going to answer a question in the chat now because someone's asked if it says discuss or explain 2 reasons, can you talk about more? If they state 2, no, you can't. I had this discussion today, really interesting question, this one, because it's unlikely they would ever say 2 exactly, because then it really limits what you can write for AO1 and you might not have enough. What they're likely to say is 1 or more, and at that point, of course, you could do 3. So I'd be surprised if AQA actually said 2 specifically. The usual wording is 1 or more, but in the sample papers, they seem to be writing 2 quite a lot. So I don't know exactly what could come up, but the usual practice is 1 or more to allow you to go on to further points, okay? Moving on now, so we're going to move on to some attachment application questions, okay? Let's imagine you were given the following question. It's one you've probably all seen, I'd imagine, but I want to make sure you know how to get 4 out of 4 on this particular question. There's a lovely stem that says, proud father Abdul was talking to his friend as they were both watching Abdul's wife, Tasneem, interacting with their baby daughter, Aisha. It's really amazing, said Abdul. Tasneem smiles and Aisha smiles back. Then Tasneem moves ahead and Aisha moves ahead, perfectly in time with each other. Yes, agreed the friend, it's almost as if they're one person. The question then reads, with reference to Abdul's conversation with his friend, outline 2 features of caregiver-infant interactions. Okay. Now, I've made this point, I think, in every webinar. If you know your specification, immediately this will help, because there are only 2 types of infant-caregiver interactions you need to know about, and therefore, if you know one is reciprocity and the other is interactional synchrony, then you've already answered half of the question already. Okay, you just need to find where they are. Just to recap those 2 things, so reciprocity is where a child responds to the actions of a caregiver. It's like they're having a conversation. The interactional synchrony is where they mirror one another, and the actions occur as if they're at the same time, as if they're sort of watching each other in a mirror. So they're in sync is the key there. Okay. Now, as I've always said with AO2 questions, application questions, highlight what it is you're going to quote. Okay. So if we think about where reciprocity is in here, clearly we've got the example there that Tasneem smiles and then Aisha smiles back. One's responding to the other. Okay. And with the interactional synchrony, it says there, Tasneem moves ahead and Aisha moves ahead perfectly in time with one another. So we've got 2 really clear examples of where they occur. Let's just see how that might look in an answer. So if we were answering that question, what we'd want to say is one feature of caregiver-infant interactions is reciprocity. We've stated what it is. Go on to define that. This is where an infant responds to the actions of a caregiver. This is demonstrated, and I really highly recommend you do this. Quote from the extract, this is demonstrated when Tasneem smiles, Aisha smiles back, okay? As if Aisha is responding to the actions of Tasneem. So I've gone on to justify why it is reciprocity. You then do exactly the same for your second feature. You'd say another feature of interaction is interactional synchrony. This is where the infant mirrors the actions of a caregiver at the same time. This is demonstrated because in the extract it mentions that they both move their heads perfectly in time with one another, which is suggesting that they're in sync with each other. Okay. Making sure I've underlined bits which actually make sure you link back to the question, because if you don't do that, you might lose yourself some marks. Quoting isn't enough. You do need to explain what that quote actually shows. Okay. So that's one of the application questions that's come up, but quite a nice one. Moving on, last but not least, and I think probably the trickiest bit I've seen in the attachment specification is where the research method questions come in. Okay, so we're going to look at some research method questions that do really require focus. They're quite tricky. Let's imagine you get this question, which may be one you've seen, might not be. It says a child psychologist carried out an overt observation of a caregiver-infant interaction, so we're on the same thing. She observed a baby boy interacting separately with each of his parents, okay, using a time sampling technique. She observed the baby with each parent for 10 minutes, and her findings are in the table below, and I've given you the table on screen there. One thing I want to point out, because the word I think confuses students, is the word frequency just means the number of times. So really it's just the number of times it's happened. So what this table is looking at is the number of times each behaviour is displayed by the infant. Okay, so the infant, for example, gazed 12 times at the mother, okay, or 2 times looked away from the parent. 6 times it had its eyes closed. So it's just the number of times it occurred. Now the question that goes with this is, using the data in Table 1, explain the procedure used for time sampling in this study. So this is quite a tricky question, and for 3 marks as well, so it's quite hard. The first thing is that you obviously need to know the difference between time and event sampling, and I wanted to make that distinction in this webinar. Okay. Firstly, time sampling is where observations are made at sort of regular time intervals. Okay, so the observer might just record every 10 seconds what's happening, every 20 seconds what's happening, or every minute what is happening. Okay. Event sampling, on the other hand, is where you count or tally every single time a certain behaviour occurs. Okay, so the little Simpson character bouncing up and down, we might just count every time he's bouncing, rather than just looking at him at a certain time frame. Okay, so that's the distinction between the two, and this question was looking at time sampling. If we go back to the question then, the first thing we want to look at is that they said that the observation was 10 minutes, so we can mention that straight away. If each observation was 10 minutes, okay, and the observer made 20 different observations, because if we're looking at it, according to this table, the child would gaze at the parent 12 times if it was the mother, look away twice, and had its eyes closed 6 times. That means there were 20 different observations that took place in that 10 minutes for the mother. Okay. What that must have meant is that the observer recorded the behaviour of the parent every 30 seconds, because if we think about it mathematically, if it was a 10-minute observation with the mother and there was 20 different behaviours recorded, if we divide 10 by 20, we get half a minute or 30 seconds. And there's your answer to this question. So just be aware, they might not ask you to define what time sampling is. They might actually ask you to work out how many times someone was sampled in a particular question. And that would be your answer. You just need to show how the procedure was used. Okay. So as I've said, we know from the extract, we're quoting from the extract, that the observation was 10 minutes long. We know there were 20 observations that took place for each parent, for the mother and the father. So therefore, each observation must have had looked up every 30 seconds. Okay, and I've given you the work in there. Quite a tricky question, that one. Final research methods question I want to show you, a little bit easier than the last one. I'll give you the extract again. Studies of attachment often involve observations of interactions between the mother and the baby, like Tasneem and Aisha. So going back to our earlier example, researchers often write down everything that happens, including their own interpretation of the events. The question that goes with this one, again quite tricky, explain how observational research might be refined through the use of behavioural categories. Now what this question is assuming is that you know what behavioural categories are, and we'll go over that in a second. But again, what I would do straight away is highlight what the relevant information is here. So the way the observation is taking place at the minute is by them just recording absolutely everything, including their own thoughts and feelings about that event. Okay, let's shift that up. What we could say to begin our answer is, well, actually, what the researcher is currently doing is just writing down everything they see, which is obviously very, very subjective. If you had 2 different observers, they're going to end up writing very, very different things about that observation. Okay. We could then say what a behaviour category is, because that's what the question is asking. Okay, behaviour categories are a way of defining specific and objective behaviours. That'll get us a mark for defining it. And I would also give an example, something that we could measure. So I've said a suitable behaviour category would be recording every single time the child smiles at the mum for more than 2 seconds. Because if you knew that's what you were looking for, 2 observers should get exactly the same thing. Last but not least, we need to say, well, how then might that actually help? Okay, the key is here, if you're looking for very specific behaviours, like the one I've mentioned, that should improve what's called inter-observer reliability. Now, don't worry if you've not come across that term this year, because you could just say it improves reliability. 2 different observers are actually getting exactly the same finding on that. Okay, so that's how you'd go about answering that question. So a very tricky 4-marker, because actually what you've got to do is quote from the extract something that is about the observation to begin with, define the key term in it, and then say actually how you might improve that observation through what a behaviour category is. Okay? And that's the last of the questions I wanted to explore. So I just wanted to look at where the different questions have come up appeared in all of the sample papers. And as you can see, in one of the papers, it was worth, I think, 8 marks worth of research methods questions. So it can be quite heavily weighted towards research methods. Okay. The other thing to note is that an essay has appeared in every single one of the sample assessment material papers. So again, there's a good indication that you may well get an essay, an 8 or a 12 mark or even a 12 mark application in this part of the course. So I'd be sort of very wary of this part of the course, because I think an essay could easily come up here, and there could easily be some observation questions coming up about time sampling and so forth, or over observations. As with all of these webinars, there will be a PowerPoint and handout available, which will be tomorrow in tomorrow's Daily Digest. And that is it now. I'm going to open out for questions, if we have time.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. We've got a couple of minutes left before we have to close the webinar. So if you want to tap in any questions into the chat screen, we'll have a look and try and pick up on those. Just a reminder, as Joseph said, that what we do is we record the webinar and then we make this available as a recording together with all the handouts and the slides on the Tutor Psychology blog, and that goes out on the Daily Digest at 8 o'clock every morning. Joseph, have you picked up any of the questions coming through? I know you've answered a lot as you've been going through during the webinar.
Yeah, many of them I think I've kind of answered. Could you explain the difference between overt and covert? Yeah, so overt means open, so the people know they're being watched. Covert, I always remember, is sort of undercover. The people don't know they're being watched. The Snapchat makes images thing is on the screen now, so you'll be able to see it, and then if you rewatch the webinar in the YouTube clip, you'll see it again. So it's actually on screen now, you should be able to see it. Sample paper 3, your teachers will have access to, because it's not available on AQA's website. So either drop me an email directly or get your teachers to email me. Annabelle, I don't think the economy is as likely to come up in this topic. It seems to lend itself well to social a bit better than this topic, although that's not to say it couldn't. You could see it coming up with sort of, if we can improve the lives of children, how might that save money for the economy and something. I have never seen one in this topic though, so unlikely. Bethany, there is a really great study which covers interactional synchrony, which you should know, which is the Meltzoff and Moore study, a really great study that will demonstrate the idea of infant-caregiver interactions in general. So remember, those two terms, reciprocity and interactional synchrony, are actually all part of one topic, which is infant-caregiver interactions. You can be asked specifically about animal studies. It's a new part in the specification. So knowing Lorenz and Harlow are really useful, because they are actually can then be used as evaluation to other parts of the course. So those two studies I recommend are really, really key. Sydney, no, you don't have to. As long as you've got 3 evaluative points, you don't need to use the ones I've suggested today. I just think the ones I've mentioned today are really nice evaluation points, because you will have probably learned about them in other areas of the course. So I'm trying to cut down the amount you would need to know. Do we not need caregiver mimicking and bodily contact? They're really nice evaluation points, Jasmine, for caregiver-infant interactions, those types of things. So actually, it's not ones I taught, but they are really, really nice points to actually know about in terms of infant-caregiver interactions. So great ones to know. Do you need to know about distortion, disruption with the mother? If you're referring to in terms of the deprivation hypothesis, not specifically, but again, really useful for further evaluation, further elaboration points in the theory. No, you don't need to know percentages, as long as you know what the findings are and you can describe them accurately. And Morgan, the role of the father attachments in the stages of attachment. So the first point, I think, on the specification is all to do with the different stages of attachment. The role of the father comes in as a secondary attachment caregiver at that point, and you can use it there. Yes, if the time sampling question come up, you'd answer it in exactly the way I went through in the video with those bullet points to show your working of how that procedure was carried out. Michelle, difficult question to answer that one. How much detail do you need to know? Potentially you could be asked an outline and evaluate question on the role of the father, so there is potential for it to be an essay. It seems less likely because if you look for all the AQA endorsed books, there isn't that much information on it, and bearing in mind the people that write those books, including myself, tend to work for the exam board as well. The exam board would acknowledge that there is not an awful lot of information on it, but I couldn't say for certainty on that.
Joseph, I think we've come to the end of the time.
To me, yes, I would plan it before writing.
Okay. Thanks very much, mate. That's what you've picked up loads of extra questions there in chat, and of course you were picking them up as you were going through during the session. Fantastic session as always, Joseph. Many thanks from all of us, and in particular from Joseph and myself, to all of the guys and the ladies who've signed in. Don't forget Joseph's on Twitter at Tutor2Psych if there's some follow-up things that you want to catch up on either this evening or later. And of course, look out for the materials being posted to the Tutor2 Psychology channel first thing in the morning. For now, we'll sign off and thank you everyone for attending tonight's webinar.